Chapter 20, as we continue in our study of the Commandments. Children are dismissed, can be dismissed now for the children's church time. And as well, if here in this room, those old notebooks that are in the seat in front of you, if you take time, please, just to record your attendance, and then out in the fellowship areas, if you'd fill in one of those cards, please, so that we can have a record of your attendance with us today. The sixth commandment, Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, reads, "You shall not murder." 4 words in our English Bible, 2 words in the Hebrew text, in the original Hebrew text. It's a terse, blunt command. No murder. Stop it. Don't do it. Okay? Let's go get some coffee. Well, there's a little bit more to it. As you would expect, there is. Let me give you 2 quick thoughts to just sort of warm us up to the command, and then we'll answer some questions about this commandment. It's a short one, but in reality, it has a huge impact on helping us understand our lives, our world, who God is, the heart of God, the nature of people. Really, the impact of this short commandment and what it represents and what it does, I don't believe it can be overestimated. So 2 thoughts to help us warm up a little bit to the command to not murder. I would imagine, I asked a couple people this morning already, I said, if we have an invitation this morning, could you come forward? If we say, come forward if you promise not to kill somebody this next week. And there was some hesitation. Saying, well, I don't know who I'm going to run across, I can't tell you how upset I'm going to get or how angry I'm going to get, that kind of thing. First, consider that the first story in the Bible about how people are doing after the fall, Genesis 1, creation, people are created in Genesis 1. Genesis 2 is sort of a look back on and a restatement of creation. By the time you get to the end of Genesis 2, though, you've taken the man and the woman who are created in the image of God, and they are brought together. Man wakes up. He sees God made woman. He goes, wow. And then God institutes marriage. And so you have a mom and a dad, Adam and Eve. And then you move into chapter 3 where sin happens, right? The fall, as Bible teachers would call it. And so after the entrance of sin into the picture and the following curse, we come to Genesis 4. Excuse me. Adam and Eve have 2 sons. You know their names, Cain and Abel. Cain murders Abel. In my Bible, you're not even through page 3 of the Bible. And you find that you have a major character, the first person born, making the decision that the best way to handle my anger, where'd that come from? My jealousy, where did that come from? And the best way to handle the anger and the jealousy that is raging inside of me as I look at my brother being accepted by God and me not, is to take his life. Cain perceives that this inner explosive rage has to be dealt with. And how does he deal with it? Well, he takes another person's life. Cain murders Abel, his brother. First story in the Bible of how these created beings are doing after the fall. You might say, well, that's just a once-off experience, isn't it? Doesn't it smooth out in the generations to come? Doesn't the Bible tell a different story, or as it gives our history? The escalation and distortion of sin, rejecting God and His holiness, is seen in its fullness as Cain's son. You remember his name at the end of Genesis 4? Lamech, or Lamech, however you want to pronounce it. As Cain's son takes multiple wives, lives a life of murder, violence, and retaliation. Lamech actually, who was Adam and Eve's grandson, probably did birthday parties for him, right? He brags about his independence from the Creator God. If God treated Cain this way, go ahead, God, look what I'm doing. I'm doing more than my dad. I dare you to do something about it. So this reality of violence and murder continues through Genesis 4 into Cain's line. Chapter 5 is the summary of Genesis, the summary of the generations of Adam. And then you get to chapter 6, and God looks down at the earth, and you remember the Noah story, and he says, I've got to do something. This world is completely violent. I need to judge it. We need to clean it up, start over. So God brought judgment on mankind with the flood in Genesis 6. And so the Bible teaches us early on that this serpent-introduced thing called sin is, in fact, as it is said in Genesis 2 or Genesis 3, it is crouching at every human being's door. And it's seeking to, and it is capable of, absolutely dominating our lives, even to the point of taking someone else's life. So how important is it that we at least take a few moments and understand this command, don't murder? All right? That's the, let me see, you're left-handed, right-handed. That's the beginning. All right, now let's move it up to today. So the second thought, just to help us warm up to not murdering each other and what the commandment means, is FBI. That's not the post-frame building thing. It is the police thing in Washington. The FBI's Uniform Crime Report for 2020 recorded about 21,570 murders last year, 2020. 21,570 murders for the last year in the U.S. That is a 30% increase. 2020 is a 30% increase over 2019 of people being murdered in America. The report examined only those that were criminal in nature. I don't know what other kind of murder there is, and defined homicides as being deliberate and unlawful killings of one human being by another. Deliberate, unlawful killings of one human being by another. Very interesting definition. We'll talk about that in just a moment. The executive director of the American Public Health Association says the rise in homicides has occurred parallel to, and this is something that Randy talked about in his prayer, it's something that all of us feel. It's hard to put our hands around it. But he says it occurred parallel to a recent rise in overall violence, hate, tensions, political divisions, and anger displayed in communities across the country. This executive director of the American Public Health Association says we're literally seeing it in front of our eyes. At school board meetings and public events, he said, people seem to have lost all civility. Now, if you're familiar with the Scriptures and you're at all prone to theology and wanting to insert theology into real life, you would say to him, no, people seem to have lost all civility. Civility's been an issue since Genesis chapter 4, when Cain couldn't handle the jealousy. But here's the quote that I like, that I think is really cool. The executive director of the American Public Health Association says, I think we need to figure out how we de-conflict our society. Figure that one out. How is it that you get people to stop yelling at each other? How is it that you get people to stop digging their heels in on a position to the point where I will take the sanctity of life away from you to get my way? I don't care about your life. I don't care about dignity anymore. I don't care about blah, blah, blah. All right? So now we're in the neighborhood of what it means, what God is talking about when he says early on, if you want to know me, if you want to love me with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you want to love your neighbor as yourself, then here's a rule to live by. Think about it, understand it. You shall not murder. So let's explore you shall not murder using 3 questions. First, what does the 6th commandment mean? There is killing that is there's killing that is absolutely wrong. There's killing that is acceptable. And then there's some places in the Bible that says kill, right? So let's talk about those. And I want to talk about them with as much humility, with as much of a learner's spirit, with this saying, boy, there are some really hard, complex ethical issues about this that good people have been talking about lovingly, sometimes disagreeing about for a long time. The command not to murder means the deliberate, premeditated, intentional killing of another person for personal reasons. You're aware that in our own law code, there's murder, there's homicide, there's degrees of each, there's accidental, there's so forth. The unlawful, premeditated killing of one human being by another. The definitive or key component of murder make it clear that a person has decided. Now, this is important, I think, because these parallels, I believe we can draw a line right over to the passage that Don read earlier when Jesus said, you've heard it said, don't murder, but I say to you. And I think we can draw these parallel key components right over to how Jesus applied don't murder to our lives. And that would be that a person has decided that another person should not continue living. Something has happened that this other person's life is expendable, a decision. Then there was a plan. There was a premeditation. There was some intentionality that went with it to think, how can I now act? I've made the decision. This person's life is not worthy. I now am going to do something about it. And then the carrying out that plan by taking that person's life. Now, in contrast, or in balance, if that's an appropriate word, the Bible does not prohibit or call for the death penalty in all forms of humans taking human life. For example, later on in Exodus chapter 21, for example, in verses 12 through 14, there is instruction. The law says that there is such a thing as accidental death. If you're swinging your tool around in the air and you're with intention, that tool, you swing it at somebody and they die, you're in trouble. You broke the law. If you're swinging that tool around in the air and accidentally you're using the tool for something else and accidentally it hits somebody and kills them, then it's interesting, in Exodus chapter 21, it uses the language, God let him fall into his hand. In other words, there's such things as accidents, but even God's in charge of accidents. But yet there's not culpability. And so there's accidental death. There's capital punishment. Genesis chapter 9, Exodus chapter 21. And again, we're going to stay on text. There are so many little tributaries that we could jump off on, not that I'm prepared to, but that little questions that are going to jump into our head. What about this? What about this? What about that? Well, the law goes on to say the person who curses his mom and dad shall die. All right? And that's right there in Genesis chapter 9. The death penalty. The death penalty is complex. One reason that the death penalty is complex, because you do not have perfect people who are adjudicating and making such penalties and so forth. But that is one case that the Scriptures mention. Another one would be what has come to be called just war or public safety. Romans chapter 13 calls the human government an avenger. God's servant, an avenger, carrying out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So it's police, war, in a just way, and so forth. And again, it can become a very complex thing. The taking of human life is a topic that has a wide application in our lives and culture. While some taking of life, such as abortion, euthanasia, suicide, are clearly wrong. They fit the definition of murder. Killing in self-defense, withdrawing life support, the killing mentioned above in accidental, capital, and just war, it is allowed for in our world. Our world does follow the evil one. It is impacted by the curse of sin. These are sometimes very complex issues. And many of you have been at the brink of many of some of these kinds of decisions about medical care for people who are tremendously ill. In the midst of incredible complexity, the sixth commandment is quite uncomplex. Of all the things that are possibilities, of all the things that we could talk about, of all the question marks that there are, there's one thing that's very clear, and that is, do not murder. Now, the truth that drives this command helps us understand the command and the heart of God a little bit better. And so let's go to our second question, and that is, what is the truth that drives the sixth commandment? The truth that drives the sixth commandment and is protected by the sixth commandment is that people are like God and represent God. Did you hear me? Then maybe one of your quick questions would be, you mean Christians, right? I said, no. People. People, whether they know God or not, whether they rebel against God or not. People are created in the image and likeness of God, which means that we have something about us as people that is very godlike, and we represent Him. Man was created and continues to be in the image and likeness of God. So I just want to walk through 4 passages with you quickly to give you the progression from the Bible that is really the support of this. This is why when you look at somebody and you have this rage coming up within you, and you begin to think, what can I do to take away that person's life, whether it's through words or other means. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27. We alluded to this earlier. Then God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. I know that those of us who believe that the Bible is true, those of us who hold very high view of the Word of God, we think, all right, people are made in the image and likeness of God, both male and female, bear equally the image of God. There is something about, and you'll notice, and we'll talk about it in a moment, you'll notice in these verses that immediately man and woman in the image of God are separated from. They have dominion over the rest of creation. Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 through 2. So you head through, even after the fall, you have Cain kills Abel, Lamech, all the violence, all of the murder and sin that is happening in that early progression of history. Genesis chapter 5 does a summary. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, He made man in the likeness of God. Male and female, He created them. He blessed them and named them man when they were created. He didn't take it away, all right? In other words, the human race is not headed the direction that is pleasing to God. And so He doesn't reach down and say, okay, you guys are on your own. People are still being created in giving birth, in procreation of people. The image and likeness of God is transferred on. Genesis chapter 9, then, we read this, verse 6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in His own image. There is a dignity, there's some kind of sanctity, there's a value to human life that is over other creation and is worthy of what in Genesis 9, when God says, by man shall his blood be shed. What's interesting, one other passage, I think it's interesting, is that now let's go all the way back through the Bible, toward the back of the Bible, to the book of James. James chapter 3, James is now talking about just human wisdom. Hey, this is how we ought to live our lives. He says, but no human being, and this is the famous passage about the tongue, about our speech, but no human being can tame the tongue. It's a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it, we bless our Lord and Father, and with the same tongue we curse people who are what? Made in the likeness of God. What a contrast. And so James even brings it up that one of the foundational bases for how we treat people is the fact that somehow that person has value. That person is sacred because we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. And so the image and likeness of God in people is the basis for why you don't kill people and why you don't curse people and why you don't treat people badly. How we treat people is, in fact, how we treat God. Because people are in many ways both like God and represent God. Let me just give you 3 ways that the image of God, see if we can bring it down one more level to our application, to our understanding of the image of God in our lives. First of all, the image of God sets humans apart from all other creation. Man is a creature similar to God, but not identical. No other aspect of creation was engineered. All right? When God says, let us make man, it's sort of like the light bulb goes on at Ford and says, better engineering, we've got a great idea, let us make man. There was some thought that went into it. No other aspect of creation was engineered to be like God and represent God in the universe. The life of people have an enormously greater value than the life of animals, trees, fish, and birds. Not that those creatures are unimportant. We as Americans spend incredibly amount of money to take care of animals. But people are distinctively set apart in dignity and worth by bearing the image and likeness of God. I know it doesn't sound like a very deep theological question, but just simply ask yourself, why don't we arrest cats that eat mice? Cats are murderers, aren't they? They kill, and then they eat what they kill. You say, well, that's silly. They're just animals. Good for you. That's all they are. They're important. They draw our attention to the fullness of the glory and the majesty, the creative majesty of our God. But yet, how can you get away with, some of you've got guns, and with premeditation, you go out there and you aim and fire and shoot and eat an animal. How come you're not a murderer? Because there's dignity, there's something special about human life. Made in the image and likeness of God. There is a dignity, there is worth, there's value that's all connected to how we were made and who we represent as humans. And by the way, I bet most of us would say we're pretty glad that we don't have to have a whole justice system for animals who kill animals. A second thought, not only is the image of God set humans apart from all other creation, but the image of God assigns or sets humans to exercise dominion over creation. In some ways, God created people to be like Himself. Not as gods, but as people bearing His image and His likeness. That image and likeness means that people represent the presence and the function of God in His world. We can know what God is like in some ways by looking at people. Dominion. And I'm going to hang in there with the word dominion. So, who's the number one dominioner? Who has dominion over all things? God. Who would you say, if there is a vice dominioner or assistant dominioner, that if you can't, if God's on vacation, who then would you go to who has dominion? Well, you go to people. Because that's who He gave dominion to. He gave dominion to people. And so one thing that you can know about God from looking at people, as distorted as it is, by the fall and by our own sin is that we tend to lead. We tend to control. We tend to care. And that's true about God. You see, I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way, but there's an orderliness to it. It's this came first, then this came, according to the Bible record. See, God thinks. God sees. God feels. God hears. He creates. God relates. He communicates. He cares. All right? That is the God that you would read about in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God. No man, no woman, no creation yet, but that God thinks, that God feels, that God relates, that God sees, He communicates, He cares, He loves. Now, He says, I'm going to make people like me. Why? So I can have some friends. So I can have some created beings who, with me and for me, and for my glory and for my purposes, we will be friends so they can see, they can hear, they can talk, they can relate, they can communicate, they know what it means to be loved, they want relationships. The image and likeness is distorted when representative dominion, all right, we have control as it is given to us by God for His glory. When that representative dominion is turned into independent dominion, I want what's around me for me. Cain made the decision that his life was his, and that his responsibility went no further than protecting his self-interest. And in that light, then, he rebelled against the God who made us, and he killed his brother. So, the image of God sets humans apart from all other creation. The image of God sets humans up or assigns humans to exercise dominion. And then just a third quick observation is that the image of God sets the value of human life. People possess the life of the one in whose image and likeness they were made. Human life belongs to God. It is a gift from Him. He is the God of life. He is the God of life and death. Life is His to give and to take. He breathed into. That's what we believe. That's what the Bible teaches, is that life began with the breath of God into a form of dust He created from nothing, and He made people. What is the value of people? Where do you trace it back then? You trace it back to the fact that we are made in His image and likeness. We both are like Him and we represent Him. Murder, therefore, is attacking. It's destroying the part of creation that most resembles God. It's the ultimate rebellion against the Creator of the universe. It kills His representatives. It denies His authority. It devalues what He distinguished as distinctly valuable and worthy. As hard as it has become due to the curse, the progression of sin, to see and appreciate the image and likeness of God in people, human life is still sacred. It's holy. It's to be protected for the sake of the one who gave it. Let's go to our third question. All right, what's the basis? It's the image and likeness of God, and so many other truths come out of that. How do we obey the sixth commandment? As we've seen in other commandments, obedience is not limited to not doing it. All right? In other words, if you go through your life and you've never killed another person, have you obeyed the sixth commandment? In a sense, but yet Jesus and James brings it up in a whole other context that we want to just look at quickly. The fullness of loving God with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind and our strength, loving others as ourselves, is only possible by the grace of God within the context of this discussion. And so with this command, which necessitates living our lives with a high view of the sanctity of human life, to attack, harm, kill people can be a direct attack on God. So 3 ways that we want to apply this command this morning, and let me just hurry through them. First of all, love others. How do we obey the 6th command? Well, we love other people. Love is anti-murder. All right? You say, well, I've never really thought of it that way, but it is. I basically have 2 options when in the way that we deal with people or we treat people. One is I'm going to take away their dignity. That's headed down the pathway of murder. Might not ever get to murder, but there's a lot of steps along the way. Or I'm going to selflessly give myself to this person and do them no wrong. Deal with anger, deal with the jealousy, deal with the selfishness at the heart level. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. So Romans chapter 13 is the passage I would point you toward. Owe no one anything except to love each other. And again, it's brought up here. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. That's the next 3 Sundays after today, by the way. And any other commandment are summed up in this word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. If you're taking notes, just jot down 1 John chapter 3, 11 through 15 or so in that neighborhood, where John says he brings up in that passage, don't be like Cain. Literally, he says, don't be like Cain, who murdered his brother. And then he begins to talk about this jealousy and anger. What do you do with the jealousy? What do you do with the anger? And he says you take care of it with love. First of all, knowing that you've been loved in incredible ways by God, and now you can pass that love on. All right, a second application would be not only how do we obey, but love each other. We're not taking time to dive into these. We will maybe a couple times. The second would be bless others. Bless others by resolving conflict. Probably the bigger issue that Jesus talks about in Matthew 5, that James talks about in James 3, that Paul talks about in Romans 13 is how we treat one another. And in their mind, as challenging as it may be for us, in their minds, they go immediately to the 6th commandment. Unresolved anger, hatred, bitterness. It's a sin against the image and likeness of God. People who are in an ongoing, unresolved conflict, especially worshiping people, according to Matthew 5, misrepresent both the God of peace and the dignity or value of people that they do not consider worthy of their love, of their kindness, of their grace, of their forgiveness. And so the question this morning that you must ask yourself with the help of the Spirit of God is, who is it that you just as soon not exist? Who in your life are you just absolutely content that you would never talk to them again, that you'll never say a kind thing about them, that they in fact are on your hit list? You may not hire somebody or actually go and do it yourself, but there's nothing sacred about them. There's nothing about them that would draw you to see in them what is true about them, regardless of what they've done, and that is what? They represent God. They're made in the image and likeness of God, and because their life is of value, I now need to love them. What does that mean when they've hurt me, when they've done something against me? We are far too comfortable in writing people off, aren't we? And they all said very silently, amen. Matthew chapter 5, what we read earlier, you've heard it said, Jesus said, you shall not murder. Whoever murders is liable to judgment, but I say to you, that everyone, and see the 3 things that he highlights, everyone who is angry with his brother is liable to judgment. What kind of judgment? Well, the same kind of judgment that murderers get. Jesus, you're kidding. You mean if I don't decide, deliberately plan, and then do the action of killing somebody, but I stay angry with them, and I don't resolve that anger, you mean the judgment's the same? It's there. He says, angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. So then he gives two illustrations. If you're at church, you're offering your gift, you remember your brother, so you better go get it taken care of, because it's really serious. You are in the process, you are in the camp of murderers. And then if you're on your way to court, you're in some kind of legal thing, come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you. No, there's bad things will happen. It can quickly get out of hand. And that's where I think we go back to in this one, bless others by resolving conflict. We do decide, we do plan, we then carry it out to desanctify people. That person is not worthy because of what they've done. Their life is not important. And so we obey the command by loving one another, by blessing others, by resolving conflict and blessing each other. And then thirdly, one that I think is just absolutely crucial is that we pursue justice. We pursue justice primarily for the vulnerable. Because we are made in the likeness of God, there's a dignity, there's a value, there's a sacredness to every human life, regardless of seeming differences or disparities that we experience in our world. Think with me about the spectrum of human life. It's immense. The unborn, the aged, the infirm, those with congenital disorders, the intellectually handicapped, the physically handicapped, the homeless, the poor, the racially oppressed, the fatherless. The list could go on, right? Of all these people who are different. And in our culture, and for those of us who are honest about it, at least honest maybe once a week about it, in our hearts, we just don't think they're quite as valuable. They're easily minimized, they're easily ignored, because they appear to lack those traits that our world, our churches, and our families define as valuable. Zechariah chapter 7, the prophet says, thus says the Lord of hosts, render true judgment, show kindness and mercy to one another. Do not oppress the widow, the fatherless, the sojourner, the poor. Let none of you devise evil against one another in your heart. But, that's the message of the Bible, that's the message of God. Now the prophet says, but they refuse to pay attention. And they turned a stubborn shoulder and stopped their ears that they might not hear. This next phrase, they made their hearts diamond hard, lest they should hear the law and the words that the Lord of hosts had sent by his Spirit through the former prophets. Therefore, great anger came from the Lord of hosts. If you are anywhere age-wise south of about 25, all right, junior higher kid, teenager, you're thinking, man, what do I want to do when I grow up? What do I want to be when I grow up? How could I invest my life in something that just makes a difference for eternity? I would encourage you to think about what kind of a vocation could you represent the dignity of human life in the places where it is most underappreciated and most vulnerable. Abortion. All you have to do is click Google and you can see the numbers. Vulnerable children. The fatherless. The social system is overrun. How about victims of abuse? How about handicapped? Here's one that will sort of either, it'll get your heart racing just a little bit probably. How about prison reform? There's a popular book. I've read it. My son recommended I do. It's called Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. A young man who highly trained, very, very skilled attorney, gave his life to selecting out of the prison system, especially in the South, death penalty cases where he was then able to backtrack and prove that the people weren't even guilty. Does that bother you? Some of you ought to become attorneys. Some of you ought to become social workers. Some of you ought to give your life in a very professional, skilled way to represent "you shall not murder," the dignity of human life. And again, it's a hot button issue, so I'll just mention it and run. But how about immigration reform? How about caring for people who don't have homes? When you see the vulnerable, when you see the weak, when you view the powerless, the abused, the disabled, the handicapped, the rebel, the addict, the migrant, the foreigner, do you default to your politics or to your faith? I'm just going to pause, let you think about that. Do you default to your politics, what you wish this country was like, or what it used to be like, or what you think it ought to be like, or does it actually enter your mind that there is an image and likeness of God at stake here? It doesn't matter what nation they're from. It doesn't matter what condition they're from. It doesn't matter what their mental capability is like. It doesn't matter what they've done in the past. There is a sanctity to human life that ought to drive us. And when it stops driving the church, we have lost our distinctiveness before God and before the world. When you see the vulnerable, the weak, the powerless, the abused, the disabled, the handicapped, the migrant, the foreigner, do you default to your instincts or to your theology, to your love for self or your love for God? Obeying the sixth commandment means that we pursue righteousness, kindness, mercy for the least among us out of honor for the God who made them like Himself and to represent Him in some way. I think I've told the story before years ago. I forget how many times. I found myself, I was traveling in Russia, go to Siberia, Irkutsk, Siberia. And my purpose of traveling was as a representative to perhaps there was a ministry going on there among orphaned and fatherless children, and I was sort of the guy getting the facts and bringing it back to the States and seeing if we could get something going with them. And on this trip in Irkutsk, Siberia, a very cold place, I took a tour through a Russian what they would call just children's home. And I remember going in, take a right down the hallway, and the person who's leading the tour take us into this room, about a quarter of the size of this room, and there's 38 Down syndrome 3- and 4-year-olds. That's where they go. Born, Down syndrome, that's the choice, go there. And I just stood there, and I'm looking around, and they're all dressed the same. And some begin to walk up and tug on my pant legs. I'm losing it. This is horrible. Could go on and on about the story. But as I walked out of it, as I walked out of the room, I had a picture taken with one little boy. I whispered in the little boy's ear, "I would take you if I could." I'm sure he didn't understand. But as we're walking down the hallway, I get this overwhelming sense that I was just standing in the presence of royalty. These kids represented God. These kids had the likeness of God. They were devalued. They were in a herd. They were being taken care of. Probably the best that those people knew how. But what do you think? How do you value those that are not valuable? How do you pursue justice? How do you bless others by resolving conflict? And how do we love? 1 John chapter 4 says that love comes from God. We're born of God. If we know God, then we'll love, and we'll love in these kinds of ways. Our Father in heaven, thank you for allowing us to study